Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for Module 25. In this video, we're going to be working on how to recognize and analyze pivot chord modulations in actual music. So we will first review the term pivot chord modulation, then we'll go into the part where we learn to recognize and analyze pivot chord modulation in a piece of music. So, quickly, a pivot chord modulation, as you remember, is a type of modulation, type of change of key that involves a chord that exists in both the old key and the new key. So in a theoretical pivot chord modulation, you'd have music in the old key, that's represented by this blue box. Then after the modulation, you'd have music that's in the new key, that's represented by this red box. And then in the middle is our pivot chord, which is a chord that exists in both the old key, the blue key, and the new key, the red key. And this is what we call a pivot chord or a common chord. So a pivot chord modulation is just a change of key that's through a pivot chord, a chord that is in common between the two different keys. Okay, so a little bit more about pivot chord modulation. They most often happen between what we call closely related keys. So these are keys that have all the same notes, or they have all the same notes except for one. And that's because closely related keys have almost all the same notes or all the same chords. So they will have at least one chord in common. So these two keys, F major and C major, are closely related. And we talked last time about how both of these keys have chords in common, such as F, such as A, such as C, and D minor. Those are all the chords that are in common between the key of F major and C major. So any one of these chords could be a pivot chord, a chord that could act as a bridge between F major and C major. Okay, so that's the basics of pivot chord modulation. And we did a little bit of analyzing some just 3-chord examples of these. So in this example, we had to identify where the pivot chord was. It's kind of indicated here. And we started off in the key of F major and went to the key of C major. So this is what this sounded like. When we analyzed it, we analyzed this first chord in the key of F, which this is a C major chord, so that was a 5. Then, by the time we get to the end, we're actually in a new key, the key of C, and we have this special symbol, which is kind of like a little bracket, on which everything to the left was analyzed in the key of F, and everything to the right of the bracket was analyzed in the key of C. Okay, so then when we get to the right of this bracket, as the piece continues, we end up with a G7 chord, which is a 5-7, not of F, but the 5-7 of C. And then the chord in the middle, the chord with the bracket, is analyzed using two different Roman numerals, the Roman numeral that is from the key of F, and the Roman numeral that is from the key of C. So this is a D minor chord, and in the key of F major, D minor is the 6, but in the key of C, D minor is the 2. So this is our pivot chord. We give it two different Roman numerals, even though it's just one chord, because it exists in both the old key of F and the new key of C. And that's the basics of analyzing a pivot chord modulation. And those examples are great, but they're not what happens in a real piece of music. So in a real piece of music, we have to learn how to recognize and analyze a pivot chord modulation. So the first thing you always want to do, since music theory is about music, and music is something that you hear, the first thing you want to do when trying to find one and analyze a modulation is to listen to the music. Okay, listen to the passage carefully and see if you can figure out where it sounds like we land on a new 1 chord, a new tonic that is not the original tonic. Then you want to find the point of modulation, and this can be indicated in the score, usually by accidentals, because since we're changing key, we'll note that we will have different notes, right? We'll have notes that don't belong in the original key signature since we're changing key. So often accidentals can indicate that we are in a new key that we've modulated. You'll also find that you'll have a chord that will belong only in the new key and not in the old key, okay? And that chord, of course, will have an accidental. So accidentals are kind of your biggest clue. Now, sometimes you'll have accidentals that don't stick around very long, right? And we know what those are called. Those are called secondary function chords. And secondary function chords are not the same thing as modulation because they're temporary. So if we see an accidental and it doesn't stick around for a long time, that probably doesn't indicate a modulation. That would indicate a secondary function chord. But if we see an accidental and it does stick around for a long time, then that probably does indicate a modulation. So you're looking for accidentals and you're looking for the fact that they stick around for a extended period of time. Then once you've found that point of modulation, the chord that only belongs in the new key, you back up one chord, and that chord is probably the pivot chord. Okay? So this is our process. The first step, listen carefully. Step 2 is find the point of modulation, find the chord that only belongs in the new key, look for where the accidentals are consistent. And then once you find that chord of modulation, back up one chord, and that chord is probably the pivot chord. So let's look at an example, and this is actually out of the workbook, so we'll look at the score in a minute. And we'll play this example twice. It has a modulation at the beginning. So let's listen to it a couple times, then we'll dive into the analysis. So I can hear from that it seems to start in the key of B flat. But by the end, it sounds like we end up in this key. So those are kind of the two key areas that I'm getting from listening to it. Let's hear this one more time. Definitely ends on that key area, which is not the key of B flat. So let's try to figure out where that change happens, where the modulation happens, and discover the pivot chord. So here is the piece written out, the excerpt we're listening to. Okay, and you'll see that it gives you a blank for all of the chords that you need to analyze, but it doesn't tell you where the pivot chord is going to happen, so it's up to us to find that. So we listen to it, and from our listening, we discovered that it seems to end in the key of F. So somewhere by the time we get to here, the end of this excerpt, we are now in the key of F. So we know that there's some kind of movement from B flat to the key of F. And another thing to kind of figure out first is, are these two closely related keys? Because closely related keys are usually the keys that have pivot chords and are the ones that are involved in a pivot chord modulation. And so if we look at their key signatures, B flat has 2 flats and the key of F has 1 flat. So yes, they only have 1 note difference, right? And that would be that B flat would have an E flat in its key, and F natural, the key of F major, sorry, would have an E natural. So when we're looking for notes that have accidentals that bring us to the new key, we'd be looking for places where we have E naturals. Okay? All right, so we can kind of just dive in, looking through. Let's look through and see if we can find any accidentals. So I see an F sharp here in the second measure. So that's an accidental. And you have to ask yourself, does that F sharp stick around? Well, we have an F sharp once. We have it twice. But then by the time we get to measure 3, it's back to F natural. And you'll see that it's F natural again. F natural again. So no, it doesn't really stick around. So that accidental is not permanent. So that is probably not where the modulation happens. So no pivot chord there, no point of modulation there, because that F sharp only sticks around for a short amount of time. The next accidental I see is this B natural. Okay, and I look through, I had that B natural, and I don't see any other B naturals because this is a B flat, and that's a B flat. So the B natural goes away quickly too, so that is not our point of modulation either. Okay, so we've found two accidentals. Here's another accidental, an A flat. So let's look through here. Yep, and I see an A natural here. So again, that A flat doesn't stick around, so it is not an indication of a modulation either. All right, so we've found three accidentals and none of them indicate our modulation. So let's keep looking. Here I have an E natural in the bass. Up here I have another E natural. Do I have more E naturals? Well, they carry over, so yes, I have one there. And then I have another E natural here, so this is sticking around a lot longer than the other ones. And keep looking through, and I have another E natural here. So it looks like E natural is sticking around for at least 3 measures. So that to me is enough to say that this is a modulation. Because if it, modulation is for a full phrase or more than just 2 chords like a secondary function. So since we have E natural here for such a long time, our modulation probably happens somewhere around here. Okay, so that's good to know. Our modulation is going to be happening somewhere in here. Okay, so we need to find, like the book says, the first chord that does not belong in the key of B flat, but belongs in the key of F. So we could kind of do some analysis here, and we have B flat in the bass. So I'll do our normal thing where we bring that all up to the top here. So we have B flat in the bass. We have a C natural up next. We have an E natural next. And there's also an F, but I think that F doesn't belong in the chord. So I think what we have is a C, an E natural, and a B flat. So C, E natural, and B flat. That's a little bit like a 5-7 chord missing its 5th in the key of F. So I think that this is our first chord that doesn't belong in the key of B flat. It belongs in the key of F. So we'll go ahead and write that this is a 5-7 of the key of F. Okay, and we could put that down here to kind of remind us. So from this point on, we're in the key of F, and that's our 5-7. So the book says that we just have to back up one chord, and that will probably be our pivot chord, as long as it belongs in both keys. So let's look at the chord before this. So we had our 5-7 chord, and the chord before that would be this chord. And let's look what's here. So we have a D in the bass. We have a B flat. We have another D. And we have an A. And that A could be part of this chord. I'm going to say it's not, because if we call it a non-chord tone, then that means that this chord can be B flat, D, F, which is a B flat major chord, which is the 1 chord of B flat major, and then it should be our pivot chord. So it's 1 in the key of B flat major, but we have to also figure out what it would be in the key of F, our new key. Okay, and our new key, F, does have a B flat chord in it, and B flat would be the 4th degree of the key of F major. So this is also going to be a 4 chord in the key of F. So that's our pivot. Now we want to include our inversions. This is a 1-6, and it's also a 4-6, because those will always match. And there's our pivot chord. Okay, so we're using that B flat chord, which is 1 in the key of B flat, but also 4 in the key of F, to bridge the gap between our old key of B flat and our new key of F. Okay, from here you'd analyze the rest of it, which I think you can do on your own. You're simply just kind of pulling all the notes that are there together, right? And making choices about what's non-chord tones and things like that. So like this first one would be B flat, another B flat, a D, and a D. And there's no, oh, you have to include this too. So that's going to be that in that chord too. So we'll have a B flat, D, and F, and it's putting this in parentheses because that A is not part of the chord. So again, we have a B flat D F chord, which is a B flat chord. So that's going to be 1. In this next one, we have a D in the bass, an F is the next note up, a B flat is the next note up. So this is a B flat over D this time, so 1, 6. And this is kind of the process. So in this next one, we have an F in the bass, another F, an A, an E flat, and a C. So that is an F7 chord, which of course is 5/7 in the key of B flat. And you'd keep going with that. So what happens with those other ones with the accidentals? Well, they're probably going to be secondary functions since they didn't last a long time. So let's see if we can figure out what those would be. So here we have an F sharp in the bass. Our next note up is another F sharp. Then we have an A, and then we have a D. So that's a D major chord, and that doesn't belong in the key of B flat. So this is going to be some kind of secondary function chord. And so since it's a major triad, we know it's going to be a 5 of something. Well, what key is D the 5 of? Well, D is the 5 of G, and in the key of B flat, G is a 6 chord, so this is a 5 of 6. Okay, and it's all first inversion, so 5, 6 of 6. This next chord is G, B flat D, which is a G minor chord. So that's our 6th chord that should follow that secondary function chord. This next one has an F in the bass, an A flat, a B natural, and a D. And if I put that all in root position, I end up with a chord that is B natural, D, F, A flat, which is a fully diminished 7 chord. So that does not belong in the key of B flat. So this will be a 7 fully diminished 4/3, since it's in second inversion, of something. And it looks like it's going to, well, B natural is the root of that chord, which is the leading tone of C. And in the key of B flat, C is 2. So this will be a 7 fully diminished 4/3 of 2. This next chord is C, E flat, and there's also a G. So that's a C minor chord. So that's going to be our 2 chord that should follow that. And from here, everything else I think is pretty straightforward. So that's the analysis for that section there. Okay, so what did we learn? We learned that we should listen to it and see if we can hear where the modulation happens. Okay, so being familiar with the exercise. The next thing we want to learn is when accidentals indicate that a modulation is happening. So we found out that they only indicate that whenever they stick around for a long time. So we saw an F sharp that didn't last a long time, so that wasn't a modulation. We saw B natural that only lasted for one beat, so that wasn't a modulation. But then we found our E natural, and our E natural stuck around for a long time. So it was actually indicating our modulation. And then 3 is to find the chord that is the chord that only belongs in the new key. So we found out that this C7 chord shows a 4/2. 4/2 chord only belongs in the key of F. It doesn't belong in the key of B flat. So that is our chord of modulation. And then we back up from there, find our pivot chord, which in this case was 1/6 or 4/6 in the old key. Okay, so that's it. We'll be doing more of this in class. Thanks for watching and have a great day.